So Professor Lisa Payton started her talk by saying how anxious she was speaking in public. And you would think over 25 years of doing this that you wouldn't feel anxious, but of course, I certainly still do. The one thing that usually gets me feeling calm is knowing that what I'm sharing is often, not the case with Dorothea Lange so much, but it's like this little nugget of wonderfulness that you get to share with people. And so that is what kind of calms me down. And I'm going to start just with this picture taken by Rondell Partridge of Dorothea Lange. That was above my bed for a long time, and then was above my office desk for a while. This was back in like the 80s, and so she's someone who I really loved, for a very long period of time. So when Carol Birkin invited me to write a biography of her for the Lives of American Women series, I was kind of over the moon. And I thought I could do it quick, and for me it was quick. It was only 5 years instead of my first book, which was like, 20 years? I don't know. It's a real pleasure to speak here to you today about this. Mandy had asked me for the Males program to speak about the book when it first came out, and my first talk about the book was here at Old Westbury. It's really great to be able to do it for the Gender Talk series and for the new Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies major that we need a cool acronym for, so you guys are going to help us find one of those. So thank you very much for this. So I wrote a chapter in my book about Lange and about gender in the Great Depression that is entitled, the title of this, Woman Can Change Better in a Man, Women in the Great Depression, 1929 to 1940. And yet somehow, when I put this lecture together, I was like, what am I going to talk about? I felt like I needed, to just look at the question perhaps a little bit differently. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of her biography. In fact, about half of this will be about her biography and her history. But I wanted to just look with you at pictures that Lange took primarily of women. And I think the themes that I see emerging from her when I'm thinking about Lange and gender. And, I'll be drawing from the book there, but I'm not actually really going to share my thesis with you unless it comes up, or how to read a photograph, which is something I love to do. Maybe we can do that in context when we're talking about the particular photographs that we took. Okay, I just have to say that I always loved her shoes and also her pants, and that's why I had to, show you this picture. Which was actually on the cover of the book, taken by one of her closest friends' son, who became himself a pretty well-known photographer in San Francisco. Gender obviously shaped Lange's life, and Lange articulated in her photographs very traditional gender ideology. So for those of you in this room who are in my Intro to Women's Studies class or have taken History of U.S. Women with me, we talk about gender roles that exist and have persisted for centuries, really. But in late 19th century, early 20th century America, gender roles were really challenged, and they were very much challenged by women. And how women's lives were changing. There was a self-conscious quest to change gender roles, but because of things like industrialization, immigration, et cetera, women's lives also changed. And so Lange is really an interesting character because she absolutely embodies those changing gender roles at the same time that she promotes an ideology that is a more traditional gender ideology. And her doing that was not uncommon in the 1930s, and so hopefully we will talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so Lange is definitely considered one of the top documentarians, I would say just generally, of the 1930s, of the Farm Security Administration photographers, of which she was part. Frederick Delano Roosevelt formed many agencies in the New Deal. One of those was the Resettlement Administration and the Farm Security Administration, which hired photographers to go across the country and take pictures. her and Walker Evans would have been the most recognized of those photographers. And interestingly, there has, in the last generation or so, been a critique of the documentary tradition. And often, Lange is the person that is pointed to, as her photographs are too sentimental or don't provoke change. They're not radical, they're not revolutionary. And so I'm intrigued by that. You know, she's really kind of a central character for that reason. So perhaps I mistitled today's talk. A Woman Can Change Better Than a Man is a concluding line from John Steinbeck's Pulitzer Prize-winning 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath, that then became an Oscar-winning film in 1940 about the migration of environmental refugees from Oklahoma to the fruit-picking camps of California. In that narrative, the mother, who won an Oscar for her role as Ma Jode, who said, "Woman can change better than a man," says, quote, "Woman got all her life in her arms. Man got it all in his head." Now, Ma Jode's encapsulation of gender roles fits a classic binary of women as tied to the physical, to the bodily, and therefore to the nurturant or the caring. And so I'm fascinated, and you know, a chunk of my book looked at the ways in which she had to deal with that binary at the same time that her life, in effect, rejected it. Her life course did not hew to that binary, and yet she promoted it at the same time. She actively promoted maternalist ideologies, and we'll see examples of that later. But she struggled as a mom, and she struggled sometimes as a wife, too. Although I have to say her hubby, number one, was really kind of a jerk, even if I like the imagery that he made of the West. My book argues, and that's sort of significant in thinking about Lange, is that in thinking about the documentary as a public form of photographic communication, the ways that caring is seen as a female activity, and it's been maligned as an effective political response. And so my biography, which took a little bit of time to find my thesis for, I actually wrote much of it before I finally settled on a thesis, took the feminist framework developed by Joan Tronto at Hunter College of care work being central to a democracy, that freedom is not just about, the freedoms that we enjoy to go out and have a good time or to make money or to have property, but that in a democracy, we need caring. And so Lange's photography, I think, is so powerful because she shows caring in action. She shows when caring is missing and the results of a lack of caring. She provokes an empathetic response. And instead of having a kind of negative reaction to that empathetic response, it's often portrayed as pity, like you feel pity for these people who are poor. I think Lange makes us feel great sympathy, great empathy with those folks that makes us then demand change. And I think that emotion, that affect, can be yoked to a political program. It's not always about sort of, the revolution, must be a specific way. Feeling is actually central to it. And I think for all of us in this room today, we live in a world where we live in a hard world, right? Where people say, yep, no unemployment, well, that's too bad. Like, you should just go to work, right? Or you might die because you can't get your diabetes treatment. Like, what a hard world we live in today. And so I think the ability to evoke caring, like, I would like to see a little bit more of that in our public space. Okay, so I'm going to tell you very quickly about her life and talk about how gender shaped it. She was born into a German family, an immigrant family in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1895. She had a pretty idyllic childhood. She was basically middle class. She was the grandchild of immigrants. But two things shook her life. When she was 7 years old, so in 1902, she got polio, and as a result of that polio, she walked with a limp the rest of her life. And she actually had her students, Leah, I'm going to take your question afterwards, okay? She definitely could walk. She had a condition called drop foot. And actually some people, to me this is part of the enigma of Lange, some people said they didn't know that she had a limp, but she said it affected her deeply, i.e. this is where I live. She lives in this foot that's misshapen that keeps her from sort of walking. A wonderful story that I don't have time for it, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that when she moved to San Francisco, she immediately wanted to do dance lessons, and she went dancing with her best friend and her soon-to-be husband. So here's a woman who's struggling to walk sometimes, and yet she wants to dance, right? She wants to basically have a good time with friends and be, you know, like every other woman. Okay, so that happens when she's 7. When she's 12, her father leaves the home. And so her mother becomes a single mom. Lange is cared for by her grandmother. Her grandmother is an alcoholic and very angry and rageful and takes that out on Lange. And so Lange's mother, to address that situation, brings her from New Jersey to New York City. And Lange just walks the streets. Lange becomes a very unhappy child. She's a truant at school. But she sort of takes care of herself by sort of walking the city streets and sort of seeing where it takes her. But these are really shattering experiences, and I think these experiences, you know, shaped her psyche some. I was going to tell you about her relationship to her mother, but I think in the instance of time, we talked about dancing instead of her relationship with her mom. But what I would say is, her mom was an amazing woman. Her mom was a librarian, and then her mom became a parole officer in New Jersey. Lange was upset at her mom because she thought her mom was, quote, too nice, that she didn't shed light on things. I feel like I see a little bit of competitiveness in Lange when she describes her mother. But to me, what's interesting about it is that Lange is positioning herself as different than her mom and is active in the world, is ambitious in wanting to change things. She described herself in relationship to other young girls in an oral history that she gave. I've always had a certain kind of drive that very young women and adolescent girls don't, I think. So she's gendering herself, but she genders herself as different than most other young women or the role models in her life. So Lange comes to adulthood at a moment in time, you know, that historians call the rise of the new women. This is sort of a concept that's a little, I don't want to say opaque, but amorphous. There's a lot of different scholarship about what constitutes the new women. But what's true from the late 19th century into the 20th century is that women are increasingly going to college, women are increasingly taking on professional work, and increasingly working. Now my statistics actually are slightly different than that, because what is interesting is that though women are going to college, though women are getting careers more and more, though there are more women in the workforce from the Civil War period through the 1930s, what is also true is that professional women, like Lange's mother and like Lange herself, that was uncommon. It was unusual. So if you're a woman working, you're probably working in a, quote, caring profession, to be a teacher or to be a nurse. You're probably not doing the kinds of professions that we might see many women doing today. Lange decided to be a photographer. It's really not clear. I mean, I read her oral history. I've read every biography about her. She kind of claims that, you know, she just got this camera and she knew she needed to be a photographer. So, you know, people have origins stories, and hers was a little hard, I think, to unpack for me. There wasn't clarity to it. Leah. You are giving me a chance to get a water break. Thank you.
After becoming a single mother, what did Dorothy's mom actually do?
She was a librarian at the East Chatham Library, which is on the Lower East Side, East Village of New York, and then she became a parole officer. So those would be highly trained positions, also kind of caring positions as well. Okay, so Lange decides she wants to be a photographer. She knocks on doors, many doors of photographers, and the first door that she knocks on is Arnold Genth's. Genth was a portrait photographer, also a documentary photographer, from San Francisco, who came east after the San Francisco earthquake. Lange might have seen this picture of Isadora Duncan, who was a famous New Woman dancer, who was sexually forward and very open about it. So when we talk about the New Women of the 1880s to 1920s, we're talking about sexual New Women, working New Women, college women, careers, all of those things kind of put together. Lange sees this image ostensibly, walks up the stairs and asks Arnold Genth if she can work for him, and he says yes. She works for him a while. She learns a lot of stuff. She moves from a couple different studios in Manhattan, and then she decides with her best friend that she's going to San Francisco. She wants to go around the world, and it doesn't work. Someone steals all their money, and they stay in San Francisco, her and her best friend. So Lange built within a year her own studio. I think she got a lot of money from a male friend to start the studio off. It was an elite shopping district. The kinds of photographs that she took in the 19-teens and 20s were these kind of photographs, kind of glossy, pictorialist images that are softer, that are kind of hiding the photographic, or the camera is an instrument, the mechanical and scientific roots of the camera. And you know, that's not what we know her for, is this, but this is what she did, and she did it very successfully. She heard her husband come into the studio and said she knew she immediately, like, something was going to happen from hearing the click of his cowboy boots. He was 20 years older than her, and a very established Western artist. He worked for many San Francisco newspapers. He did the illustrations. He was part of the Age of Illustration, the Golden Age of Illustration, at the end of the 19th century.
What up with that first one?
You mean the naked lady? I remember that you don't like naked ladies, Leah. I don't know, but I do believe that it's just a naked woman on a chair. Huh? Oh, but obviously some folks do. It's a bohemian restaurant. She married a bohemian, so both of them were part of a community of men and women who broke more traditional sexual boundaries. And I just told these guys, I think, right, about, like, they wouldn't let me she was, like, always going skinny dipping with her friends, and they didn't let me put that in the book. I thought, that's weird. Why can't I put that in the book? I don't know if they thought it was a book for students or what. It seemed a little strange to me. Anyway, she gets married. I only have 6 minutes, so I better hurry up. She gets married. They have a pretty traditional relationship. And I want to read to you just something that she said about the kinds of work that she did for her husband, Maynard Dixon. So she becomes the main breadwinner in their family. He's an amazing artist. He gets commissions for doing fancy hotels like the Biltmore Hotel in Arizona. I think it's Prescott, Arizona. The Mark Hopkins Hotel. If you ever go to San Francisco, you can just, like, take the elevator up to the top room of the Mark Hopkins Hotel, which is like a fancy hotel, and his mural of Calipatria, which is sort of the patron saint of California, is up there, and it's really beautiful. And you know, he made a lot of money, but he pulled back when he got married to Lange so that he could do more painting on his own, and she made the money in the household. When the Depression hit, and I'm not going to tell you anything about the Depression, feel free to ask me you know, in the Q&A, but when the Depression hit, like many Americans, they were hit financially. So her husband lost almost any commission he had, those big kind of mural commissions. And she lost about a third of her income from the portraits that she was taking, because rich people just didn't want portraits, I guess, at this point of time. Her husband decides that he wants to go to Taos, New Mexico, to kind of ride out the Depression. And really what he wants to do is join Mabel Dodge Lujan's sort of wild and crazy community in Taos, where he thinks they can live cheaper. And they do, because they kind of live in one of the adobe huts there. But that adobe hut had no water, and it had no electricity. And Dorothea Lange was forced to do all of the things that she always had to do, but now she didn't have water and she didn't have electricity. So at that point in time, she described, well, I'm going to show you this real quick. These are some photographs that she took when she was in that area. We can talk more about the content of these photographs. I think they're stunning photographs, but you could also say that they are exoticizing photographs in some way. There's not a lot that's left from this period in her time, but these are two really stunning photographs that she took. She described seeing Paul Strand. Now, Paul Strand is one of the well-known modernists from really the teens, I think he started taking pictures. These are three of my favorite pictures of him. And she described seeing him in Taos, and what she said in her oral history is, quote, "A man in a Ford used to drive by almost every morning. I saw this very sober, serious man driving with a purpose down the road, and I wondered who he was. It was Paul Strand. And it was the first time I had observed a person in my own trade." She called herself a trade person at this point. She didn't see herself as an artist, even though today we would recognize her as such. She'd never observed a person who took his work that way. He was a private purposes that he was pursuing, and he was so methodical and so intent on that. He looked neither to the right nor the left. And then she says, but the thing that Paul Strand was able to do, I wasn't able to do. Women rarely can, unless they're not living a woman's life. So she took her domestic responsibilities really seriously. She then continues, I could be of help to Maynard mostly by keeping everything smooth and being happy and making it an enjoyable time and taking care of the 3 kids. I baked and cooked, and you know, when there's deep snow on the ground, you've kept busy. The gloves, the galoshes, the wet clothes. You put them on and you take them off. So in that quote, she's describing not just doing the reproductive labor of keeping the household going for all of them, but the emotional labor, the affective labor of keeping him happy so he can do his work while she kind of ignores her own career. Again, I think it's interesting that she's very clear about it. She knows that this is what she's doing. They returned to San Francisco in the fall of 1931. There are stories appearing in the newspapers about their return and how great it was that they went to Taos. And again, she kind of says that her chief job was keeping Dixon from the petty, personal things of life so he had a clear field to do his work. Not long after that, they separated. They went to live in their separate studios, and like many Americans, they actually boarded their children out because she couldn't make money if she was taking care of the kids, taking care of him, and so they boarded the children out. And this is something that Linda Gordon's biography spends a lot of time on, and I actually think I have a slightly different take because I really felt like Lange's potential for caring for those kids was somewhat limited, and it wasn't uncommon to board your kids out, particularly for people who were economically in trouble at that point in time. So the Great Depression creates great changes in American life. For women specifically, I've got exactly a minute, so what I'm going to do is talk about those changes, and then I'm going to show some more pictures of what that Lange took. So maybe I'll take 30 minutes instead of 25. But this is one of my favorite photographs of hers called Mended Stockings, 1934. And I love it because she shows how this woman lovingly is attempting to maintain her self-presentation. She's taking the time to sew up, her stockings so that the runs don't show. But no matter what that woman does, her stockings keep on running, right? And so you can see them here on the right. So you see the kind of attempt at keeping up appearances, and specifically gender appearances in this moment in time. Okay, that's the magic. Okay, so I'm just going to take a couple more minutes. So a couple of the effects upon women specifically in the Great Depression, and for those of you who are unaware of the Depression, I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, but sort of the most important thing, and it certainly shaped my family's life, a quarter of the population was unemployed for nearly a decade, from 1930 to 1940. There were times where the numbers would go down, unemployment would drop, but then it would go back up again. And so, more recently, unemployment has gone up to 10%, maybe 12%. So think about that being doubled, and then being doubled for a decade. And then, of course, much worse in the black community, much worse in working class mining communities or particular industries. Horrible time for the economy, but particularly for working class people. But it affects families, obviously. So the idealized nuclear family eroded in the Depression. Desertion rates went quite high in this time period. Divorce rates dropped because people could not afford divorces. Husbands would just leave, or wives would just leave. People boarded their children out, or they put them in orphanages, as I said. A 50% increase of the number of children in orphanages in this decade of the Great Depression. Fertility fell precipitously as women chose not to have kids and used contraceptives. Birth control usage also soared. Abortion also increased greatly in this time period. The number of women appearing at the hospital from botched abortions went sky high in the Great Depression. And finally, women worked a whole lot more in the Great Depression than they had prior to this point in time. But it was under really tough circumstances. And black women, were being forced out of the jobs that they had just, let's say, clawed into in the industrial economy. They were pushed out back into the domestic sphere. And then from the domestic sphere, they were now competing with white women who also needed jobs as maids maids or cooks, et cetera, nannies for people with money. So what I did now is I'm just going to show you these photographs really quickly, and then maybe we'll center on one photograph per category to talk about the ways in which Lange makes gender in her photographs. So woman and motherhood is the most important one. People have said that Sally Sign said she didn't take many pictures of women with children, and I'm like, what are you talking about? I still don't understand why she said that. This is the most famous photograph that Lange has taken, supposedly the most reproduced image in the world, according to Martha Rossler, of a, quote, migrant mother. Really classic photo. We can talk about it more if you'd like. But she took this photo again and again. This was the photo that appeared on the poster of an African-American woman who picked cotton in Arizona.
The year says 19, can you go back to that picture?
Let me go through them and then I'll come back, okay? She's got a woman in a camp. The detail I love about this photograph is that the foot of the bed is in a tin can, and it's in the tin can to keep rodents or pests from getting up onto the bed. This one, so, you know what I'm going to do? Sorry, I should have done this to start with. Okay, that way we don't have to see that ugliness. This is a really classic photo she took of a couple on the road, Japanese family, mom and daughter or child in Guadalupe, California. Japanese worked in the farms but actually tended to own them more by the 1930s. A Mexican mom with her child. So you just see this image again and again. And then even little children caring for other little children. So here she's pointing to the exigencies of work, where kids have to go out into the fields to help their parents, or because the parents have no childcare. But she's also playing, I think, off of that image of mother with child. And this is a classic one, and if you'd like to talk a little bit more about this, scholars have noted that she took other pictures of that woman where she doesn't look anywhere near as desperate, right? So like what's the impact of that? And we can talk about this if you'd like. So mother and child, I think, is one really central theme. And the maternalist ideology, and I thought I put it here, but maybe it's the next one here. The maternalist ideology is asserted very strongly in the 1930s, not just by Dorothea Lange, but by Hollywood movies like the Grapes of Wrath, like novels like The Grapes of Wrath, like the murals that the federal government is making, or the statuary that they're making, or art being done in New York City. So she's not the only one doing it, but she's someone who knew the challenges of motherhood in this period, and she's idealizing it. And she's putting it out into the world. So, we can talk more about that. She takes reproductive labors really seriously. So if she had to get water in Taos, New Mexico, here she shows, here's a young girl getting water from a ditch, basically. That's what was available to migrant farm workers in California. I love this photo of the woman, one woman with the little child and the other woman caring for the hair braiding her hair. Someone, very young someone, making a meal for her family in a shack. A young girl making butter on a porch. And Lange loved crafts. So I like the fact that she points out what the chair is made out of, and the churn itself, I can't tell, but I think that churn might be a homemade churn. I'm not sure. The camps that were set up for migrant workers, and Lange and her husband were central in California in establishing those camps so that people migrating from the environmental crisis of the Dust Bowl had somewhere to live. This is Tom Collins, who's the character who appears in The Grapes of Wrath, but in a camp. And again, you kind of see the tools of reproductive labor in and outside of the tent. You see a nursery. This is a more staid image of hers, I think. And then this is definitely a promotional imagery of the New Deal, where she's promoting the Kern County migrant camp. So instead of living in tents, people can actually have laundry. But she's attentive to those labors. She shows the mothers' clubs in one of those camps. Okay, so I'm going to end there. And then I think she does an amazing job. I mean, I think what draws us a lot of times to Lange is her ability to convey a psychological feeling or connection with people. And some of that has to do with the fact that she's showing people in themselves, like deeply in themselves, and she kind of captures that. And I didn't put down the name of this, unfortunately, but this woman is in a camp in California. One of my favorite pictures, ex-slave with a long memory, woman in Alabama. So it's 1937. Slavery ends in 1865. So this woman could have been 30 years old and 90 here, right? Or 92. Yeah. So actually, Lange took a lot of pictures. I don't know that anyone's written about it, but Lange took a lot of pictures of, quote, ex-slaves. And most of them are not, this woman, you can tell she's had a hard life. And she's, I don't know, when I look at her, you can tell she's struggled. But she's holding herself up strong and erect. It's such a beautiful photograph. She has other photographs of ex-slaves taken in Texas that are much more like portraits and very beautiful images of people, men and women. And I think, the New Deal captured lots of interviews with ex-slaves, and I think she, when she went south, was really blown away by the conditions that she saw there. So I think she wanted to capture that. This is a young girl in Bosque, New Mexico. child and her mom in Wapato, Washington. This is on the cover of Bastard of South Carolina for any of you who've read Dorothy Allison's book. She loved showing off handicrafts, particularly women's handicrafts, in this case quilting. And then the final one is women in work that I want to do. So if there is a female maternalist trope in the 1930s, the heroic male laborer is also an important theme in visual imagery and also actually in literature from the late 20s through the 40s. On the left is a Hugo Gellert image, and on the right is a mural done by the federal government, Julius Waltz, whose name I don't remember. But Lange shows lots of women working. So here we've got a Mexican grandmother pulling tomatoes. We've got an African-American woman working in a field. And I'm going to, I thought I was going to end with this photo. I'm going to end with this photo because I love it so much. This is the last photo in my book. And I love it so much because this is taken later. This is taken in the midst of the war. She was in Richmond, California, which was part of the shipbuilding industry. This woman is a Rosie, right? A Rosie the Riveter. And I just love it because she's looking at that guy with such a tough look and the sign above which says serve you. And she's not going to serve anyone, right? she is sort of casting off that role of domesticity, casting off that role of a black woman having to do that kind of work. And it's not that we know that, but I think the photograph kind of conveys that kind of stalwart drive for something new and something different that the World War gave both to women and also to African Americans. So I'm going to end there, and kind of what I thought is that we could just go to any photograph that you want to talk about, or you can ask any question that you'd like to ask. And I'm sorry I went over 25 minutes. I am into this. Yeah, I am into this. Hunter.
Did the sign, is it just the way it looks that it says serve you? Because it could be like serve your nation.
That is a great question, and I don't know the answer. She actually took several pictures of this woman. Yeah, maybe it was like an automat. It might have been a restaurant, like an automat restaurant. Do you know what those are? Okay, cool. Does everyone know what an automat is? Like the New York used to have these things, you just put some money in and the food would come out. So maybe it's one of those, but yeah. But this particular image, I think, is the strongest of the group that she took. Yeah, thanks. Leah, don't you have a question? You had so many questions. Okay. Mandy.
Yeah, it's interesting that at a time when most images of women are very glamorous, Hollywood, kind of smiling and beautiful, she's giving women permission to look sorrowful and angry, in pain, dirty, and working. It's really opening up representation for women in a huge way.
I really love that. That's.
Yeah, she doesn't have any glamorized pictures. They're real.
They're all very real. She was quite explicit that the commercial images of women, the advertising images of women were not something that that she loved and that she wanted to, she wasn't saying I need to see different women, but she wanted to valorize, after her death, a book was published called Country Women. If I can get my glasses on and look, I'll find the title of it exactly. But she said she wanted to show the grit of women that consumer culture does not show. And she saw it in, she had all these quotes that she would pull and put into her books. And she definitely saw it in women's generative capacities, women's ability to have children and to create nurturant environments. But she absolutely thought that that was not the image that the mass media was portraying of women in that time period, whether it was Hollywood images or advertising images. Yeah. Yeah, she didn't get to publish that. That book came out right after she died, but she'd been working on that project for a while. And it was rural women. It wasn't urban women, which is interesting because she was an urban woman. She grew up in New York and lived in San Francisco her whole life, so it's kind of interesting.
Did she ever talk about why that she focused on rural women?
I'm going back in my brain and seeing if there's anything in my brain file. No, I think she just thought that, like, working the earth, but I am not sure. I actually would want to go back through my research and see. Yeah. She was also really interesting. At the end of her life, she started taking a lot of, she got very sick. She couldn't work for many years. She photographed the relocation and then the placing of Japanese Americans into, in effect, concentration camps. And what some people say, she didn't say this, but what some people say who were with her at the time, that just, sickened her, that she couldn't take the stress of that. And she had a horrible ulcer. She ended up with esophageal cancer, which is what killed her, but they didn't really know what she had, so I was going somewhere with that. So for a long time, she couldn't photograph because she was just too sick to photograph, but she always carried a camera with her. And towards the end of her life, she talked about what a world there was in the domestic sphere, and that photographers really had not taken advantage of photographing that and representing that. So she did have a really clear sense of this division and also the lacks or the inability to sort of depict that world. And she was starting, she took pictures of her family on the California coast because she wanted to show that life, that domestic life, and sort of the universals within that domestic life. I mean, that kind of accords with the family of man aesthetic, of course. But yeah, Heva. And then
what you said about showing their internal lives, women's internal lives, because you don't think of a photograph as being able to do that. So I think that's really a good thing to point out. And also with her boarding her children out, I mean, you said it was quite common, but I think it's just worth noting that what she had to do to be a great photographer, that she had to make a choice.
Yeah, her family basically fell apart. She had very challenging relationships with her kids. They ended up working it out, but it was never easy, in part because she was just a really domineering personality. So, she fought a lot with her grandma, but in effect, she was very domineering as her grandmother was and couldn't deal with, the kind of challenges that come up in family life.
Although she photographed them.
She photographed them beautifully. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And so she did have to make a choice. You're right. And she did. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, if her husband had made more money, I don't know what that would have looked like. She ended up, her first husband clearly didn't support her career all that much. Husband number 2 really did, even though he expected her to do the domestic work too. He made her career in terms of not her photographic artistry, but in terms of maintaining her archive. I think he was really critical.
But, she traveled around. She couldn't be home, so she was all over the country. She was not home.
Yeah, well, but that was a problem for her because the farm security, she was the lone photographer on the West Coast, and Roy Stryker, who ran the Farm Security Administration Photographic Division, which is actually called the Historic Division, he had trouble with people who knew what they were doing, so Walker Evans and her, he really struggled with. But he was pissed at her that he couldn't write to her and say, hey, I want you to go to Texas and take some pictures. She had a family. She couldn't just do that. And so that caused some friction between them. So yes, she traveled all over the world, ultimately the world, in this time period, the US, but she had to make arrangements to make it work. So she wasn't like the photographer, like a Margaret Bourke White, who might just go off. Yeah. Leah and then Jessie?
Why are you so interested in Dorothy Lange's work?
Why am I interested?
Yeah. Why? What about her caught your attention?
I just think her photographs are really powerful. They're emotionally powerful. So, as a scholar today, I'm intrigued by the fact that she has been so much subject, and I don't, Haywan will know this, but so much subject to the documentary critique, and yet photographers love her work. There's very few photographers I know, who aren't moved by what she did. So I just think she's got an ability to convey emotion and feeling and repression maybe. This is one of her, to talk about psychology, this was also taken in Richmond, an argument in a trailer camp where people feel like, the anger's right there, that she really captured that. Jesse.
My question actually follows up a little bit. I'm wondering, did she think of herself as an artist? Because, I think you mentioned that strand, that whole strand, you think of stateless and stylized.
Yes.
And high art.
Yes.
And this trade work, this
Yes.
labor.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And I'm wondering if she ever, considered, because I look at it, and this to me feels like art.
Yes.
Like I'm moved by this. But I'm wondering about her own identification as an artist in her moment, or was it more like
Yeah.
trade for her labor?
Yeah. So, no, that's such an interesting question. So she definitely saw herself, coming up as a commercial portraitist and as a trade person. And she was, right, in those early years. That's what she was mostly doing. She describes in the Great Depression seeing the horror around her and not knowing what to do about it. And she describes her fellow California photographers as taking pictures of rocks and leaves, and she tried it. She wanted to be an artist, but she said, I can't do it. I just can't do it. And so she knew that her subject was people. It probably wouldn't be for a couple more decades that she would really see herself and call herself an artist. And she wasn't humble about her work. She knew the power of her work. But, photography at this point, by the 20s, Paul Strand, he's taking straight photography. That's what he would have called it. And it was definitely seen as artistic at that point. But her friends like Ansel Adams or Edward Weston, they also have a kind of straight style. These guys saw pictures of naked bodies and peppers today in class. So straight photos, but they're clearly artistic. So she's making pictures at a moment in time where the documentary is just getting its name and photojournalism is just getting its name. And so she's part of who and what is defining it at this moment in time. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's great. And I think there's also the issue of gender as well. And all the artists you mentioned were
Men. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no. That's a really interesting question. I'm trying to think if I can date. I mean, she was a big cheese. So she comes to New York City in the 50s in the Photo League, which took documentary photographs, in the 40s and early 50s. She comes speak to them, and they're just so amazed and loving that she's there. And she had an authority about her. She knew, I think, how important her work was. But yeah, this question of was it art or not? Yeah. People didn't even know what the documentary was. Literally, people date the documentary as being named in the 20s with Grierson in Britain, who's a documentary filmmaker. But, Roy Stryker's asking in the 1930s, what's the documentary? We got to name this thing. And then when the Photo League asks her, they're still writing in the 1947, 1950. What's the documentary? We have to define this thing. So it's a little amorphous, actually. And whether it's artistic or not, or documentation, which photography, its history in the 19th century is, it's a document, it's truth, it's reality. Yeah, Haywan.
I just wanted to mention that in the context of documentary photography, there is that persuasive element. It's not just to factual documentation, but it's there's that perspective. It has to be empathetic, persuasive quality, and also Dorothea Lange airbrushed out certain elements from the photographs, and she was very much caring about the quality editing processes. So I think she very much cared about removing certain elements that wouldn't fit there and so on. So I think
Okay, the thumb is here in this one. It's funny, I'm so over this argument, but I'm really interested in it. She did have a sense of artistry because this thing here is Florence Thomas's hand holding on to the tent pole, right? And Dorothea Lange is like, what's that ugly thing down there? Like, and so in most images, you're not going to see that thumb because she wanted it out of there. Yeah. Do you want to say more about that, Haywan?
no, yes, exactly. She brushed out that thumb, and actually, most of the photos that got printed later doesn't have the thumb.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm very impressed by the extensive knowledge you have.
5 years. Or something like that. I don't know. 5 or 6. Actually, it might have been 7. I know it was 7. Damn. Any other questions? Or are there any photos you want to ask about specifically, Jessica? Or talk about specifically?
With the photographs, since she traveled a lot, did she purposely go to like places to take pictures, or was it more like I'm traveling and I see people and I take a photo?
She was purposefully going to take pictures. Yeah, so the federal government, I guess I didn't finish my story, but she didn't know what she was doing. She goes out on the streets and starts taking pictures of poor people and people on the streets in the midst of the Great Depression. And she literally doesn't know what she has. And other people look at her work and they're like, well, what is this documentary? They don't have a name for it. Like, why are you taking pictures of poor people on streets, right? But in the mid-30s, there's a growing recognition that the photograph can be a powerful communicative tool, can document in the more traditional sense of provide evidence, but also persuade people that new government programs should be put in place and the rationale for those programs. And so she gets hired from the federal government. Her husband number 2 makes that happen. And husband number 1 actually helps them. It's like for a while they're traveling all together, which is kind of fun. But the government says to her, we want you to go on a 3-week trip of the Great Plains and Texas and New Mexico. Or what actually happened more often was you're going to go from California all the way to Florida and Georgia and North Carolina and then come back. So she did that in 1935, 36, 37, 38. I think 39, she went mostly north and to North Carolina. And then she was fired, in effect, in part because I think Roy Stryker was, he just couldn't deal with people. He liked the youngins that he kind of brought up, like Russell Lee. And so he let her go. And she still continued to work. She worked who did she work for? She worked for the state government of California, and then she worked for the Bureau of Agricultural Economics. So she did continue to take documentary photographs, but she wasn't part of this great team at that point. Yeah. She did a book. She called what people were going through, quote, human erosion. And she wrote a book called American Exodus that was about that human erosion. And in that book, all the pictures she took, her and her husband organized that trip so that they could have those photographs for the book. Yeah. Heather.
Following through, I mean, there clearly was a political purpose to these photographs, promote these government programs and to change the society. But I'm just thinking, the women's movement, we talk about the personal is political, and she used the personal to make a political point. And she did such a good job of it. I think that's what's so nice about it, is that it all kind of comes together.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. Absolutely. Laura. So she met her. It's a very cool story, actually. Her husband saw some pictures. The first pictures she took in the Great Depression of the San Francisco strike, the citywide strike, general strike that happened in 1934. And he saw them at a gallery, and he said, I want to put them in this article that I'm doing for the Survey Graphics. So he got them from her. He paid her for them. And then he ended up taking photographers out to see like poverty, because he worked with impoverished migrants. And she went with her friend, who's also an amazing photographer, Imogen Cunningham, and I think one other photographer with Paul Taylor. Paul Taylor was an expert interviewer and an expert sociologist and agricultural economist. And he used things like oral histories and photography to say that the agricultural economy had to be dealt with. And the other agricultural economists thought he was crazy. But he's very well known today, to this day, and he saw her work and just was in love with it, and she was in love with his ability to talk to people and interview them, and basically within a very short period of time they fell in love. And the relationship with Maynard Dixon was really bad. He was not a kind man, Maynard Dixon. A nice artist, but unkind human being, at least to Dorothea.
Even today. But when I think about 1930s, when this is very near to us, and she's walking around in the rural spaces and capturing this moment with probably a sizable machine.
It was big. It was big.
And with a very limited options, right? Probably she couldn't take like pictures like we are doing today, like hundreds of them back to back.
Right.
So when I see that and looking at these pictures, seeing that these women in their intimate, places and very honest and clear. There may be some manipulations, of course, but they seem real to me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's telling me that she had this connection with these people, with these women. Kind of amazing. I just want to point that out. Like it is really different. Probably it should be very different being a photographer, in that era compared to today.
Yeah.
So with all these kinds of limitations, the results are amazing. Just to look at the things and and these are not like taken far from those people. She was really into their face in most of the things. Like one of them, the first close up of the leg.
Mended stockings, yeah.
So, this is not an easy task to approach to someone you don't know, just start taking photos.
Yeah, and actually that photograph, she took multiple photographs, and so there is a photograph or two of the full woman, but then she gets in close. Robert Capa says, if you're not taking a good photograph, go closer. And a lot of Lange's better photographs are, she just keeps on pushing closer, closer. My grandmother the same way. Yeah. No, the camera was super heavy when she first started going out into the streets, because she'd always worked in a studio where she had total control. Really different being on the street. She walked with a limp. She went with her brother, and she went with other people because she was basically scared, she said. When she went on her government trip, she often went with her husband, or Rondell Partridge went with her several times. So she tried to get someone to come with her because it was really hard work. There was no air conditioning in motels at this point in time. These were big drives across the country to do this kind of work. Yeah. So I just want to thank you, Mandy, for organizing this.
Well, I hope you'll join me in